So get comfortable and get excited for some homeopathy. So today's presentation is titled Homeopathic Management of Overlapping Infectious Diseases. And I have the honor to introduce Dr. Sharum Sharif, who is a licensed naturopathic physician, 2003 graduate of Bastyr University. He also has graduated from the New England School of Homeopathy and is an active member of the American Institute of Homeopathy. He works full-time as a naturopathic physician and homeopath at his clinic in Kent, Washington, and is an affiliate of the clinical faculty at Bastyr University. He's given numerous talks at many of the naturopathic schools across the country and continues to be an advocate and speak on homeopathy to many of the state associations as well. Dr. Sharif has written a book on homeopathy titled Visual Homeopathy, and he has extensive teaching on his website, visualhomeopathy.com. So with that, I get to introduce him now. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'll see you. The subject today is, as you can see, is about the homeopathic management of overlapping infectious diseases, co-infections, or simultaneous infections. At the very top, did you guys all get the sheet? Who didn't get this sheet? If you didn't, raise your hand and Noah will hand it to you. So at the very top of the first sheet, you may want to just handwrite, and if you're attending the talk virtually, you may want to somehow make a note that the subject of overlapping diseases here applies to infectious or non-infectious, acute or chronic. So all the principles we're going to cover, they're not just going to involve infectious diseases. It's going to be infectious or non-infectious, acute or chronic. So the principles are all the same. And then, as you can see from you can see the first page starts out with what makes two diseases similar or dissimilar homeopathically speaking. We're going to talk about that. And then in the middle of the page, see it says overlapping dissimilar diseases. And there's some different scenarios and examples for each scenario on the first page. And the middle of the second page, we have overlapping similar diseases. And there are some examples under that. And at the very bottom of the second page, you have final summary of all overlapping diseases, dissimilar versus similar, any combination of acute and chronic. So at the very end of this sheet, if you could just make a note of writing something, then it'll make this perfect. It'll make it complete. And I'm just going to read this. Treatment summary. And I'm sorry it's not in the handout you have. This is just something I added recently. With acute infections, you want to treat what you see. You treat what you see, which is based on the presenting symptoms, regardless of the lab title, the lab-based diagnosis. So in homeopathy, you just treat what you see. When symptomatology changes during the course of the illness, you will need to alternate remedies. So as the symptomatology changes during the course of the illness, you alternate remedies, particularly in regards to overlapping complex conditions. And that's all in the PowerPoint, but I just want to highlight that. If you wrote that down and you have this and you're here, you can just go to the pools now and you don't have to attend the rest of the talk because that's a summary of everything I'm going to talk about. Dr. Luis is going to do it, I know it. So there are different versions of my PowerPoint presentation. What you have is fine, but what's up here today is slightly updated. Some of the slides are in a different order, so it flows better. So you may want to just follow me here. And the version you see up here is going to be on my website in the next week or two, which is the most updated version. And we don't have to cover every slide, as you can imagine. We have like 250 slides, so I'm going to skip through some slides, but I wanted the material to be in your PowerPoint so you have access to it for later. So again, we're going to emphasize overlapping acute infections today, and the reason is that I think most of us are concerned about epidemics, not just any overlapping situation. So we're just going to focus on overlapping acute infections. So remember last year we had the tripledemic of the RSV, flu, and COVID, right? And I remember I was wondering how I was going to tackle that. It took me a few minutes, like how are we going to, and I remembered, we're homeopaths, so we can just treat what we see. So So it wasn't a big deal. I had patients with RSV, I had patients, of course, we all had patients with flu and COVID, but I had a few patients with RSV. Homeopathy was highly effective. I'm sure you guys have seen your share of overlapping diseases during this pandemic. I've seen many patients with COVID and long COVID, and then 6 months later, as they're dealing with long COVID, they catch Omicron, and they have seasonal allergies on top. I'm sure. Who has seen these kinds of overlapping situations? Would you just raise your hand and keep your hands up? Okay, now hold your hands up. Out of those people that have raised your hands, who had good results with homeopathy treating them? If you did, keep holding your hands up. Okay, there we go. And then raise your hand, and drop your hands. Raise your arms if you didn't do homeopathy and still had good results with these overlapping conditions. We have, okay, wonderful. We have a few that did good even without homeopathy. That's wonderful. As you can see, it gets complicated when you have overlapping conditions. So these are just various terms that we can have referring to overlapping conditions such as co-infections or simultaneous infections. So what matters here is if these co-infections are similar or dissimilar, and we're going to talk about what that means in a minute. I've given 2 talks so far at the AANP on epidemics. One was in 2019, a few months prior to the pandemic, titled Homeopathic Prevention and Treatment of Epidemics and Pandemics. And I gave a talk at AANP last year on homeopathic management of COVID and post-COVID. Those are the topics I covered in 2019, and those are the topics I covered last year in Spokane. And today's discussion talk is going to be, here we go, we're going to talk about some of the lessons that I myself, I'm sure, as well as other homeopaths have learned during this pandemic, dealing with COVID-19 and long COVID. I'm going to talk about the convenience of using homeopathic assessment of epidemic diseases as opposed to lab-based diagnosis. I'm going to talk about some evidence about effectiveness of homeopathy and cover the significance of overlapping infectious diseases, the homeopathic management of overlapping infectious diseases. We're going to talk about some basics of homeopathy like the law of similars, and we're going to delve into the organon and how organon views similar versus dissimilar disease, overlapping diseases. And the subject of complex diseases, which falls under dissimilar overlapping diseases. We're going to get into that. And then some nuts and bolts of prescribing and the top remedies for acute respiratory infections, which I'm sure you guys are interested in. So these are the lessons that I have learned. First of all, for those of you who have access to my 2019 talk on homeopathic management of epidemics, I wanted to make a slight modification to my 2019 talk, and I highlighted the modification, so you may want to take a note of that. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, based on my research, I came up with a summary of how to handle epidemics and pandemics, treatment-wise and prevention-wise. So since then, thanks to COVID, we have learned some things about how to handle epidemics, and so I'm modifying what I said in 2019 slightly. So that's the new modification, and we're going to talk more about that in the future slides. So as you know, the virus has been mutating. That's just Omicron, how it's mutated over the last year and a half or so. And as the virus mutates, the top remedies change. Who knows that among you guys? If you know it, could you raise your arms? Like who has noticed that as the virus mutates, the remedies change? Not many, unfortunately. So there's go. My kids and my students, and they know that, and Dr. Louis. So you should definitely make a note of that. Dr. Robin Murphy, our favorite homeopathic teacher in North America who passed a couple of years ago, unfortunately, he talked about epidemics, and he would emphasize the significance of that. As the virus mutates during an epidemic, the top remedies change. And here we go. So bryonia was the top remedy for the earlier variants. And I think that was the consensus on the part of most homeopaths in the world, if I may say. And my last year's talk at AANP covers that in depth. So this is a good picture from the Homeopathic Remedy Pictures book. A bryonia patient is usually, they want to sit down, they don't want to move. If they move, all their symptoms are worse. They're dry everywhere inside and outside their body. They're thirsty because they're dry, and they're usually thirsty for cold water. And they're angry and moody like that guy in the picture. So when we had Omicron, the top remedy changed, and I think based on my understanding, my findings, as well as some other homeopaths I've been in contact with, the top remedy became Kelai-Bic, and that's obviously kind of a funny picture of Kelai-Bic. You have this stringy, gooey, thick, gross, postnasal phlegm that condition comes with. So for Omicron, the top remedy has been or had been K-Libic, but now it's changing. And I'm not seeing as many K-Libic cases in my practice the last few weeks. And what I am seeing is phosphorus. And just based on the last few weeks, I'm seeing a lot of phosphorus cases. Patients are coming in, they have shortness of breath, so it's, I hadn't seen that for a year and a half, and they're thirsty for cold water, and they have a burning sensation somewhere inside the body. Those are the keynotes of phosphorus, as hopefully you all know. Then some updates on long COVID. Unfortunately, I'm still seeing some long COVID cases, bryonia long COVID cases. They have patients that caught COVID prior to Omicron. They would end up landing in the bryonia land, and they would have demonstrated top keynotes of bryonia. And 2 years later, 3 years later, they still have the keynotes of bryonia, which is devastating, and I'll talk more about that. I'm seeing a lot of long COVID K-Libic cases, people that caught Omicron. They needed that remedy right there with the gooey, stringy, thick post-nasal drainage sinusitis, and they were stuck, have been stuck in that state for like a year since the beginning of 2022. So those are some of the things I'm seeing regarding long COVID. And regarding bryonia long COVID cases, that remedy is critical. If a person has long COVID and they need bryonia, honestly, I've seen a few hundred cases of long COVID, and these patients that I have seen, they had sought help from other naturopaths, conventional doctors, acupuncturists, some of them more creative, more other systems of medicine, like Ayurvedic medicine even. And honestly, the ones that needed bryonia, at least my patient population, they weren't getting the help they needed. It was bryonia that did the trick. So bryonia long COVID cases, they need bryonia. I persist on my assertion that the bryonia cases, they don't do well with other therapies. They need that remedy. It's critical. And you can read those few cases I've listed there. Like I had a patient who came in. She was basically using a walker for a year and a half. And I told her, it seems to me like based on your symptoms, you need bryonia, and there's a really good chance that you had long COVID. You caught COVID a year and a half ago prior to Omicron, and that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with long COVID. And she said she tested negative for COVID. She never caught COVID, but I'm fairly confident that's what she had. And bryonia 30C for 4 weeks completely reversed the situation. She was able to walk back completely normally without the walker. That's after a year and a half of near paralysis in the left lower extremity, which is a keynote of bryonia. I've seen many cases like that. These patients walking in, limping on the left side. If those of you out there have seen that, would you raise your hand? I just want to see if you guys are seeing bryonia cases, long COVID cases. Okay, one or two cases that I've seen so many. It's heartbreaking. They all limp to my office, and a few weeks later, they walk just fine. So, and half of them are constipated because the dryness is a keynote of bryonia. Okay, so, and you can treat long COVID acute with acute homeopathy as well as constitutional, and that's a long conversation, discussion beyond the scope of today's talk. When do you do acute, when do you do constitutional? So I'm a member of the American Institute of Homeopathy, and that's their journal, and I just want to share with you that during the course of the pandemic, many of the board members of AIH wrote articles on homeopathic management of COVID. As you can see, almost all the authors are conventional doctors. So the president and board members of AIH are basically exclusively medical doctors. I think there's a DO and one naturopath. The rest are like all medical doctors. So for those of you who think we're the ones doing homeopathy, there are a lot of medical doctors and osteopathic doctors who are doing homeopathy in North America and across the world. I think that's going to be refreshing, hopefully, to some of you guys to hear about that there are conventional doctors who support homeopathy, who practice it, and they write wonderful articles like this one. Dr. Cooper treated severe COVID using the remedy carbonium oxygenosatum, which is homeopathic carbon monoxide. Dr. Andre Saint talks about that in depth in one of his articles that was published on hpathy.com. So as you can, hopefully you will agree with me, the human condition is critical, unfortunately, due to all kinds of reasons. One of those reasons is infectious diseases. They're a major challenge to humanity and public health at large. They pose the greatest threats to mankind. I don't need to convince you of that, I'm sure. COVID-19 just by itself gave rise to numbers of non-COVID-19 diseases like TB, HIV, malaria due to interruption of services. According to a New York Times article, COVID-19 set us back by about 20 years in relation to the treatments, how far we had gotten with TB, HIV, and malaria. So just the one pandemic affected all the other pandemics. And that shouldn't be surprising to us. Very unfortunate, but it's true. So public health, here's a list of the major epidemics of the modern era and public health emergencies of international concerns. These two slides took me about 6 hours to put together. It's a summary of the top epidemics of our times during the modern era. It's interesting here to note that SARS, which is caused by SARS-CoV-1, we had that in 2002 and 2003. That was found to come from China. And of course, now we have SARS-CoV-2, and some people think it came from China. That's kind of interesting. They're both SARS viruses. So dengue is the most rapidly spreading pandemic of all those pandemics I just listed. Malaria, obviously, is a major pandemic inflicting humans over millennia. It's probably the largest pandemic we've had ever, and it's taken millions and millions of lives, and it's still around, and unfortunately, it hit close home. Recently, CDC put out an alert about 5 locally acquired cases of malaria in Texas and Florida. Tuberculosis, which is one of the top pandemics, is the second leading infectious killer after COVID-19, and now we have multi-drug, multi-antibiotic resistant tuberculosis, which is not good news. So we have to have alternative treatments for TB, not just antibiotics. And in my 2019 talk, I have a whole section on how to manage TB homeopathically. You may want to refer to that. TB has claimed more lives than malaria and HIV put together, and according to conventional medicine, the TB vaccine is not a perfect solution. So how are we going to prevent TB? So hopefully this is where homeopathy is going to come in, and I wish we had more of you guys, more naturopaths who are interested in homeopathy, because the time is going to come when homeopathy is going to be, we're going to need homeopathy more than we have so far, I believe. So Shigella is another one of those infections that shows resistance to antibiotics. I read the top symptoms of Shigella, which is diarrhea, nausea, and abdominal cramps, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, Nux vomica might be a good match for Shigella. And then I'm thinking, wow, Dr. James Bell, medical doctor, in 1869, he wrote this amazing book that I have in my library. He covers the top 400 some remedies that are useful for diarrhea. So we have this wealth of knowledge from over the last 200 years that we can use to treat future pandemics. WHO is concerned about antibiotic resistance. Doctors are concerned about antibiotic resistance. And climate change is not helping with public health and antibiotic resistance, just health in general. And that's beyond the scope of our presentation, of course. So how about the next pandemic? I'm sure some of you guys are concerned. People are concerned. And I think we would feel much more secure and safe knowing that we have therapies that are not only effective, but also readily available and safe. So WHO calls the next pandemic disease X. And here's the question. How many of you guys without homeopathy would feel confident taking on the next, God forbid, pandemic? And I think I did get a show of hands. There were a few of you in the audience that did well without homeopathy, and that's great. But there weren't many. And I think if the audience were all exclusive homeopath, I'd like to think, based on what I've seen the last few years, I think 99% of you guys would have kept your arms up. That's what I've seen among my homeopathic colleagues, and I've been in the circle for a while, and I think homeopaths would just all keep their hands up. So homeopathy is an understatement to say is the most effective system of medicine when it comes to epidemics and pandemics. And we're gonna share some information on that with you. So that's the title of an article, New York Times article, "The Dead Birds Are Falling from the Sky." We're talking about the bird flu, which in the recent past has decimated birds, domesticated as well as wild birds. And the concern is for someone who has human flu to contract bird flu, and these genes combining and igniting the next possible pandemic. That is the concern. And the vaccine, as you know, it takes a while for vaccines to come out. Even if they were effective and safe, it takes time. Here we go. In blue there we have if a mink farm worker with the flu also catches, with a human flu, catches bird flu, those two we could have gene swapping, and that could just ignite the next pandemic, God forbid. And bird flu, I mentioned in the earlier slides, it affects birds, domesticated as well as wild. What we have now seen that it can affect minks, and minks are mammals just like humans. So the bird flu virus has already crossed species to mammals, including minks. And we have cases, here we go, according to CDC, we have cases of humans catching the bird flu. We have cases of human-to-human transmission of bird flu. So the one thing that could really push us over would be if you have somebody with human flu catching bird flu, and then that combination going from one person to another. So we have the bird flu going from one person to another. Imagine a person has human flu, they catch the bird flu, they get the combination, and if that goes from one person to another, that's where we can be in trouble. So not to scare you guys, but it's a possibility. Homeopaths are probably the least scared of all because we're like, we got a tool in our bag of tools that we can use. And I'm not sure how everybody else is feeling out there. I'm not sure how conventional colleagues are feeling. Probably not too excited about that. In homeopathy, we don't really care about the type of germ. We're looking at the symptomatology that the patient is presenting. We don't really care if it's bacterial, viral, fungal. We don't really care if it's human flu, bird flu, COVID. We just see the symptoms. We look at the picture, the symptoms the patient is presenting with. We find a remedy that matches the symptoms. So the type of germ doesn't matter. And that's a very, very key advantage we have over conventional colleagues. And even other, say, naturopaths that don't use homeopathy, we don't really need to know homeopaths. It's like we're free from that requirement, which is such a blessing. So let's talk about diagnosis and testing briefly during epidemics. As you know, most epidemics involve broad common symptoms like fever, achiness, cough, fatigue, headache. So it's really difficult to tell what you're looking at without a lab diagnosis. Misdiagnosis during overlapping infectious is more of a concern. So let's say, just looking at allergies, common cold, RSV, flu, COVID, how do you know which one the patient is presenting with? It's very difficult to know because they're similar, as you can see in that chart. And let's take dengue, which is the fastest spreading epidemic and pandemic in the world. It really sounds like the flu when you look at the symptoms of dengue. Tuberculosis, which is the second killer in the world after COVID, is very similar to COVID, and so on and so forth. So we have limitations in regards to conventional methods of diagnosis when it comes to lab tests, physical exam, general symptoms. So all those tools that we use, conventional colleagues, let's say non-homeopaths, I guess, I suppose I could probably maybe say that, the tools they use for diagnosis has a lot of limitations, as you hopefully would agree. So, and I'm going to tell you how homeopaths would assess in a minute. So, those are the limitations of lab-based diagnosis. Here's just one article on the limitations of labs. Just a recent article from June of 2022, right there. You can see that the COVID case rate was 19 times higher than reported. That's a Canadian article. And honestly, that didn't surprise me when I read that, because I've had so many patients that come in, they're like, I tested negative for COVID. I'm like, I know, I hear that all the time. You have COVID. And they're like, how do we know? I'm like, because I've treated a lot of COVID patients. I know you have COVID. So then there's this battle of minds. I have to convince the patient that they have COVID. I'm like, you know what? It doesn't really matter, because for all practical purposes, I can offer you this remedy. It's probably going to help you. And really, we don't really need to know if it was allergies or COVID. I can help you. So bottom line, we don't really need to know. But just as a matter of sake of argument, we have a lot of COVID here. So a lot of patients are coming in with allergies. Raise your arm if you see a lot of patients coming in with allergies and you know they don't have allergies. They have post-COVID, specifically post-Omicron. Would you raise your arm? You're not seeing that. Okay, a couple. So I believe that there are a lot of patients out there. I see a lot of them. They come in, they're like, I have allergies. My allergies are the worst this year. And really what is happening is that these patients with allergies, they're struggling with post-COVID, specifically post-Omicron. They have that thick, remember that funny picture, they have that thick, gooey postnasal drainage, their sinuses are plugged up, their nose is completely plugged, and they think this is allergies because it looks and sounds like allergies, but it's not. I'm like, have you ever had allergies? The patient is 50 years old. They're like, no. I'm like, okay, so they're like, maybe I started to have allergies this year. I'm like, no, this is post-Omicron. You need the remedy Kelai-Bic, and they feel significantly better within a few minutes of taking the remedy in the office. Like Kelai-Bic 200C, within 10 minutes, their throat starts to feel clear. And overnight, they feel significantly better. And we can cure them with Kelai-Bic. Okay, so CDC talks about the limitations of testing of bird flu here. These are limitations of physical exam. One obvious limitation of physical exam is if you have a significant, dangerous pandemic, you wouldn't want to do physical exam on them, right? Like COVID, during the initial phase of the COVID. So there's obvious limitations of physical exam during pandemics, especially dangerous ones. If you go by general symptoms, we talk about what are the limitations of general symptoms. A lot of pandemics present similarly. Here's a CDC article that talks about how the bird flu is very similar to COVID if you just go by symptoms. So, and misdiagnosis is much more likely to occur with similar overlapping diseases regardless of the method of diagnosis. So in conclusion, we need better methods of diagnosis or assessment of epidemics. We need alternative methods and treatment that are reliable, safe, effective, and practical using hopefully virtual visits or phone visits when dealing with epidemic diseases, especially in the midst of overlapping epidemics. And homeopathy can be used both for diagnosis, assessment, as well as treatment. So we look at not just the general symptoms, but we also specifically look at characteristic symptoms, and which we're going to talk about that, like what does that mean in homeopathy? So let's take COVID, for example. Common symptoms of COVID, everybody knows here, right? Common symptoms are fever, cough, shortness of breath, body aches, headaches. Those are the common symptoms for the prior variants. And for the newer variants, we have different common symptoms, like the allergy symptoms. And what are the characteristics of COVID? Well, we're going to talk about that. The characteristic symptoms of COVID, they change from variant to variant. So the characteristic symptoms of the latest variant presently would be the Cali-Bic type characteristic symptoms. And prior to that, we had the Bryonia, let's say, characteristic symptoms. Here's just a side point. When I get a patient with, let's say with long COVID, how many of you guys feel confident that you can diagnose long COVID? Just raise your arms. You can diagnose it not without homeopathic knowledge. If you didn't know homeopathy, how confident would you be that the person has long COVID? You still could. That's pretty amazing. I don't know how without homeopathy you could diagnose long COVID. I'd love to learn. Maybe after the talk, please talk to me. Like, how can you tell the person has long COVID without this homeopathic insight? I'd love to learn from you guys. It'd be very difficult as far as I know. And let me tell you this. If a person comes in, they have Bryonia symptoms, and they've had those symptoms for 3 years, I'm fairly confident that they have long COVID because they caught COVID, they went into Bryonia, so that's pretty obvious. Without that knowledge, I think a lot of at least conventional colleagues would be overwhelmed. Like, they don't know. A lot of my patients who need Bryonia, who have needed Bryonia for the last few years, they're not being diagnosed. Their doctor says, oh, your RA, arthritis is worse. Your fibromyalgia is worse. Your headaches are worse. I'm like, well, they used to be right-sided, your migraines. Now they're left-sided. Isn't that interesting? For after 20 years of migraines, they became left-sided because they went into Bryonia state. So it is a long COVID case. So what about vaccines? I guess we don't need to talk about vaccines too much, but as you know, they're inefficient and slow during epidemics. Those are some disadvantages of vaccines. And yes, they currently our mainstay of prevention, and they're highly regarded in the world as the mainstay of prevention. I'm not going to argue with that point right now. I just want you to see these are some obvious limitations of vaccines, and that's the chart that compares homeopathy with vaccines. I just want to highlight the speed of action of the remedy is immediate. The vaccine can take a number of weeks, typically. At the speed of intervention in the society, homeopathy can be immediate if the public health was for us. Whereas vaccines, to spread the vaccine throughout the society, as you know, takes a long time. Vaccines can have pathogens sometimes inside, and people worry about safety. With homeopathy, there is no concern for that. There's a concern of shortage with the vaccines. We don't have to worry about that because we can mass produce homeopathic remedies. We can graft them at home, right? So we don't have to worry about shortage. And so on and so forth. So now let's say vaccines are the best method of prevention. Let's just make that a statement, assumption. Even if that's the case, I think homeopathy can certainly be a bridging device until vaccines, safe and effective vaccines are available. And I'm sure you would agree that at least it should be a bridging device for the 6 months or 9 months it takes to come up with an effective vaccine. So let's just skip that. So let's just talk about homeopathy. Let's go beyond this biochemical world, beyond flat earth medicine, which is based on biochemistry. Homeopathy can be an effective tool for managing epidemics. It's been one of humanity's most powerful treatment modalities for dealing with epidemics and pandemics for about 200 years. You can refer to my last 2 talks to just to learn what is happening around the world and even in the United States as far as what we're doing regarding epidemics and pandemics. Hahnemann started the use of homeopathy for prevention of epidemics in 1799. He recommended the remedy belladonna for the prevention of scarlet fever. Apparently that was so effective that it basically led to the Prussian government at the time in 1838 to order the use of belladonna for prevention of scarlet fever outbreaks. That's how it all started, I think. Why homeopathy? There are a lot of reasons for why homeopathy. You can read that. One relevant reason is that we don't have to worry about supply chain uncertainty because we can, again, we can graft these remedies. Homeopathy can adapt quickly. That's the key, again, advantage we have. As the epidemic mutates over time, we can quickly find the indicated remedy, right? We don't, if we were to change the vaccine, I don't think we've even changed the vaccine. The vaccine presently for COVID is what we had 2-3 years ago. It's the original vaccine as far as I know. So whereas with homeopathy, we had bryonia, now we have Kelabig, we did for a while, now we might have, maybe you have phosphorus, I'm not sure what's coming up next, but we can come up with the remedy like that. We are adaptable. And during the course of an illness in the same person, as their symptoms change, we can adapt, we can change the remedy. So there's another place where homeopathy is highly adaptable. So the word adaptability is, I think, a good word that summarizes the main advantages of homeopathy over allopathy and other systems of medicine. Homeopathy is growing in the world. We have literally hundreds of thousands of physicians worldwide practicing homeopathy, many of whom are conventional practitioners, medical doctors, osteopathic doctors, etc. I think naturopaths are actually a minority. So it's funny how many of them are conventional. So despite all odds, homeopathy continues to gain popularity, and there's present-day evidence on PubMed. There are thousands of articles on PubMed that discuss homeopathic. Basically, they are homeopathy-related. Dr. Iris Bill talks about the mechanism of action of homeopathic remedies. This might interest you. Dr. Iris Bill is a medical doctor, PhD. He's a member of American Institute of Homeopathy, and he basically talks about homeopathy, refers to it as nanopharmacology at its best. And I think that just summarizes homeopathy in a nutshell beautifully. There is an article written by Dr. Bell as well as Dr. Liana Standish, one of our own, who actually, along with some other colleagues, published this amazing article. They talk about homeopathy as having, among the traditional systems of medicine, homeopathy has the most extensive experience. And it's also, they point out that homeopathy, they refer to it as pulsed dose nanomedicines. So I love that, pulsed dose nanomedicines. That just energetically feels right, that this is how homeopathy would work. We've known it all along maybe, but they're finding the science that shows it. Here are lots of articles written by Dr. Iris Bell on the subject of homeopathy being basically nanomedicine. Here are some government studies that prove that homeopathy can be an effective branch of medicine. This is a 2008 study by Government of Ireland. Here's a study, a meta-analysis of 86 articles from India that shows promising results for homeopathy in management of infectious diseases. Here's an article from the UK, 9 randomized controlled trials that suggest that homeopathy is at least equivalent to conventional medicine when it comes to uncomplicated upper respiratory tract infections. And here's an Austrian government confirming the use of homeopathy as an alternative branch of medicine for antimicrobial resistance. It was published in 2022. This is a Swiss government study recently concluded that homeopathy is effective, cost-effective, and safe. That's also recent. It's from 2022. And we have studies on HP, which is homeoprophylaxis. This is a good study here done by Dr. Golden that basically involved 90 million people who benefited from homeopathy with a very impressive level of effectiveness. These were government-ordered studies. So we have historical evidence, lots of historical evidence. You can refer to this book. This is probably the best book I could find on the subject of historical evidence that shows the effectiveness of homeopathy as compared to other treatments. Why do medical historians ignore homeopathic statistics? Dr. Bradford, in his book here, he basically says perhaps the reason is that most would rather not see the ineffectiveness of conventional therapeutics nor affect the efficacy of homeopathy when it comes to epidemics and pandemics. And I think that kind of wraps it up. There's a lot of political reasons behind it, unfortunately. And God willing, anti-homeopathy rhetoric will soon be irrelevant, according to this article here. And we can all pray for that, because we need homeopathy for pandemics. So let's talk about homeopathy. The basic law of homeopathy is the law of similars. I'm sure you know that. Like cures like. Here we go. This basically summarizes the law of similars, and hopefully I don't have to, you guys know about this, you can read it. In a nutshell, the remedy must be stronger and most similar to the disease. So when you give someone a remedy or a medicine, pharmaceutical medicine, you basically are inducing a state in them. It doesn't matter what they're taking. It could be natural or pharmaceutical. The patient goes into a state, and that state is important if that state is similar to the disease that they have or is dissimilar. So you give a remedy to someone, you're creating a state. And if that state is similar and stronger than the disease, you'll cure that person. If you give a remedy to a person and it's not similar to the disease, we're not going to remove the disease. And that would be what's happening with allopathic medications. They don't work based on the principle of similars. And we're going to talk more about that. Here's a patient I had from Kenya, a virtual patient. That's a picture, before and after picture of her hands. She's seen multiple dermatologists in Kenya. They couldn't treat her staph infection. And I took her case. She had all the signs and symptoms of the remedy Apis, and the remedy Apis, I think within a week, cured her case, her staph infection. She had been dealing with it for, I think, about a year, if I'm not mistaken. So within a week, we cured it, and the top symptoms of Apis matched her symptoms. And that's how homeopathy works, based on the law of similars. So the top symptoms of the remedy Apis completely match her symptoms. Basically, we're like matchmakers. I'm like, the Apis matches her symptoms, and it worked. Bryonia happened to have this, keynotes of Bryonia happened to match the top symptoms of COVID during the initial phase of the pandemic. That's why the remedy worked, because Bryonia is what, remember that picture? A Bryonia patient they don't want to move, they're kind of moody and angry, they want to be by themselves, they ache, their symptoms are worse on the left side, they're dry inside and out, and they like cold water. So that kind of matched the signs and symptoms of COVID before Omicron, and that's why, based on the law of similars, that remedy was so curative. It was helpful for the majority of cases that we saw in our practices. And again, it's the law of similars. So let's talk about today's topic, which is overlapping diseases. And remember, today's topic is summarized on this sheet. So remember I said if you just have this sheet, you don't even have to attend the talk. So this is it. We're going to start talking about this, but let me just point out something. With the principles discussed in the organon, which we're going to cover right now, we have access to a powerful tool that can help us better be able to both assess and treat various overlapping conditions. This is the Organon, of course, a book written by Dr. Hahnemann over 200 years ago, the person who started homeopathy. He was a medical doctor, as you know. And he's an online source of the Organon. I love that e-journal called Hpathy. The founder of Hpathy, Dr. Bhatia from India, he's an MD homeopath. He's written many articles on the subject of similar, overlapping diseases, similar and dissimilar. Those are the articles that I actually referred to and then used along with the Organon to come up with today's presentation. Extremely helpful. I actually emailed Dr. Bhatia to ask him to clarify something that he was saying in one of the articles, and he got back to me within less than 12 hours. None of my American colleagues were that speedy. He was on it, and his response was right on. It was amazing. It's an Indian colleague. He's phenomenal. He's extremely knowledgeable, and I was really confused as to how do you know if two diseases are similar versus dissimilar? And we're going to talk about his response. The following slides here basically come from a PDF format file from Julian Winston that summarizes the main aphorisms that cover the subject of overlapping diseases very briefly. So those are like summaries of these different relevant aphorisms that we're going to cover today. Two major words that you're going to see on this piece of paper that you need to totally understand. One word is suspend, the other one is remove. When we say suspend, we're basically implying that one disease, when you have two overlapping diseases, one is suspending another, and then when the first one goes away, does its thing, if it doesn't kill you, the disease that was suspended returns. So that word suspend means implies returning of the disease that was suspended. The word remove implies that one disease literally gets rid of another disease, removes the other disease, annihilates it, extinguishes it. These are homeopathic terms used in the Organon. Basically, cures it. So you need to understand that, otherwise this whole subject might be vague. I mean, you may not completely follow. So again, how do we know two diseases are similar versus dissimilar? This is probably one of the most important slides in the entire presentation. We're not looking at the biochemistry of the germs, we're looking at the totality of symptoms. So if I get two different germs going into my body, and my body is looking at them, if my body thinks of these two germs as if they were to create similar symptoms, right, then my body would consider them, if the symptoms were similar, my body would consider these two diseases as similar. But if each disease were to manifest different symptoms, then my body would consider these two diseases as dissimilar, the same two diseases. So we're looking at totality of symptoms. We don't really care about the biochemistry of the germ, and I'm going to talk more about that coming up. So if two people get measles and whooping cough, let's say 3 people. In one person, these two diseases may be considered dissimilar by that person. In another person, these two diseases may be considered similar. In a third person, the same two diseases may join together and form a complex disease, which we're going to talk more about. These two diseases are extremely important. Or slides, I'm sorry. So this is what Dr. Bhatia said about similar versus dissimilar diseases right up there. Similar to what I said earlier. So the principles discussed here, again, apply to acute versus chronic, not just acute, but also chronic, infectious as well as non-infectious. So let's talk about an example of what happens if you have two dissimilar substances like oil and water. They repel each other, right? A similar situation is happening when you have two dissimilar overlapping diseases existing in the same person at the same time. The stronger disease can repel or suspend the weaker one, or the two diseases can combine and form a complex disease. This is a summary of what happens with overlapping dissimilar diseases, which is on first page. This is the first page of your handout. Got it? So either they repel or suspend each other, or the two diseases combine in the person, they mix, combine, and form what they call, homeopaths call a complex disease. So dissimilar diseases don't cure in nature. That's important, like how nature, what would nature do? Just always ask, what would nature do? If you have two dissimilar diseases, they don't cure each other. Okay, with the same token, dissimilar therapies don't cure a disease. So that's why allopathy doesn't cure usually. And we're going to talk more about that. That's aphorism 35 from the Organon. So that's aphorism 39. Antipathic drugs create an artificial drug disease dissimilar to the original disease. Allopathic drugs don't cure because they're incapable of producing a state similar to the disease. They only suspend, suppress the disease. That's based on Organon. And they might be helpful. Allopathic drugs save lives. We're not arguing with that. But they often don't cure because they don't produce a state that's similar to the disease. They can even sometimes cause an additional disease, as you all know. So let's talk about the different scenarios under dissimilar diseases. Scenario 1 is if the old disease, the disease you already have, is strong, and then you have a new disease coming in that's weaker. In that situation, the old disease, because it's stronger, repels the new incoming disease. That would be as if, let's say you're at home, you're strong, and some intruder comes in, and the intruder is weak. Well, you might be able to repel the intruder. It's kind of a similar situation here. These are some articles by Dr. Bhatia on the subject. So on the first page under overlapping dissimilar diseases, as you can see, there are a lot of different scenarios. So the first scenario is when the old disease in the person is stronger, the new disease coming in is weaker. There's another episode where you have the two diseases have equal strength. And under that category, we have different possibilities. If they have equal strength, then how do we know what happens? They're dissimilar, but they have equal strength. According to the Organon, here, this is a good, I came up with that. I thought that would kind of help you guys. So we have two people here wrestling. They're different people. They're dressed in different colors. Their outfits are different. Let's assume they have similar strengths, and let's say assume they have the same skill level. Who is going to win? Probably the person who is more vicious, right? It's the same with viruses. If you have two dissimilar diseases with similar strengths, whichever is more virulent will dominate and suspend the other. And there's an example of scarlatina and cowpox in the Organon. Okay, so what if two diseases are dissimilar, do they always repel each other? No, sometimes they combine and exist in the person at the same time. And that's when you get a complex disease. And most human beings today are suffering from complex chronic diseases, according to Dr. Bhatia, which I agree with. So this is aphorism 40 from the Organon discussing complex diseases. And this tells you basically what happens when you have a complex disease. Talks about the rarity of complex diseases. So the Organon talks about what happens if you have smallpox and measles. In 300 cases, only in one case did you have a complex, did they observe a complex disease. The rest of them, one would repel the other. Whichever one was stronger would repel the other one. But in 1 out of 300, they combine and form a complex disease. So it's a rarity, according to the Organon. But I wrote this at the bottom here. Most of us, most human beings, are suffering from complex diseases. So why would Hahnemann use the word rare above? I believe that's because he is discussing overlapping, dissimilar, severe acute epidemics, not dissimilar chronic conditions or less severe overlapping acute infections. I know that's kind of a complicated thought, but I thought about that. Like, why would he say rare when we see that so much in our world? And I'm pretty confident that's why, and Dr. Bhatia talks about that in his article, which I found extremely enlightening. Nature itself permits the simultaneous occurrence of 2 to 3 dissimilar diseases. Nature allows that. That's why allopathy, which basically is based on the foundation of dissimilars, it doesn't cure. And diseases, with patients that are treated allopathically, all the diseases stay in the body. It's because that's what nature allows. Nature doesn't allow 2 dissimilar diseases, multiple dissimilar diseases to cure one another. So based on that, that's what happens. Allopathy is really based on that. It's based on the law of dissimilars. How do you cure complex diseases? Well, Hahnemann says if you have 2 different diseases existing in the body at the same time, forming a complex disease, you use multiple remedies because it's a complex situation. You use one remedy for disease 1, one remedy for disease 2. They're overlapping diseases. They're dissimilar. They form this complicated, complex condition. You need more than one remedy. And I've seen that in my practice. And some of my students hopefully saw me doing that, treat a complex patient with multiple remedies at the same time. And a lot of them would ask me, why are you doing that? That's not homeopathy, Dr. Sharif. And I remember telling them, it just makes sense. And now I can back myself up. Hahnemann talks about it. So, and that you change the remedy as the symptom picture changes. So there is scenario 2, which is on the top of the back page of your handout. Scenario 2 is when the new disease is coming in stronger. Remember, the first scenario is when the old disease was stronger. The second scenario, top of the second page, is when the new disease coming in stronger. In that situation, the new disease will suspend the old one. And then the suspended disease will return later. And there are 2 different sub-scenarios under that. And the first scenario is where the first disease is chronic, the second is acute. The second one is when they're both acute, and they're both dissimilar. So see how it can get complicated, and that's why this took me a year to prepare. So you have access to all these slides. You can review it and think about it. I promise you it will make sense if you just allow yourself time to think about it. And again, this sheet summarizes it all, so it's all in one place, so it can make more sense. Otherwise, it can be Organon, can be overwhelming. Okay, so this is basically some things you can read to just help yourself understand this better. Under the second scenario, which is remember the back of the second page, we're talking about suspension. There are 2 different scenarios that we talked about. The first one is scenario 2, Roman numeral 2A, and we have 3 examples listed there. And the second item there is scenario 2B, and we have 1 example of smallpox and measles listed there. That's the top of the second page. So I don't want to read all these for you. You can read these examples yourself. I'm just going to suffice by talking about this issue, this example, which is not on your handout, which is how the inoculation of one disease, cowpox, can suspend the course of another disease, mumps. Those are 2 dissimilar diseases. So why would the inoculation, the vaccination for one disease, suspend the other one? See, with the knowledge of homeopathy, you can actually make sense out of some of these things that are happening. So that's because they're dissimilar diseases. One is stronger than the other, and it's doing what? It's suspending the other. So that just makes sense when you look at it from the perspectives of Organon. In the past, if I had read that, it wouldn't make sense. But now I'm like, oh, they're dissimilar diseases, and one is stronger. And of course, that makes sense that one of them is going to suspend the other. So I thought you might find that interesting. Like, imagine somebody getting the COVID vaccine. I mean, what if that suspended the flu? I mean, it's possible. So the second subject here is overlapping similar diseases. That's on the second page again, and this is easy. When you have similar diseases, it's kind of like what we see in homeopathy. One removes the other. Let's say you have COVID and the flu virus comes and it's similar, your body considers that a similar disease. Well, one can remove the other. Whichever one is stronger will remove the weaker one. So that's based on the organon. And it's almost like, imagine being out there in the sun by the pool, it's sunny, and you light a candle. Will you see the light of candle? Probably not, because the sun will take over. That's how homeopathy works. You give a disease that's similar, a remedy that's similar to the disease but stronger, and it literally will annihilate the disease. It's just very much like the sun annihilating the light of a candle. And Rumi has a quote that I thought was beautiful: before the sun's resplendent ray, no candle that did ever flame. Because you don't see the flame of the candle, right? That's just, and Hahnemann talks about daylight extinguishing the side of Jupiter. Again, this is same thing. Stronger disease, a remedy similar and stronger to the disease can remove it. We can learn from nature. Similar diseases do not repel nor suspend each other, they remove each other. It's these similar diseases that repel and suspend each other for the most part. But similar diseases, they neither repel nor suspend. They cure each other. One cures the other. They annihilate each other. They remove each other. So there's all these examples here you can see under the overlapping similar diseases. The first one is not written on your sheet, and that's the example of a organon, aphorism 46. They talk about swelling of testicle by a bruise, and they also talk about how swelling of testicle is a symptom, frequent symptom of smallpox. So you have one symptom, which is swelling of testicle caused by a bruise, and you have the same symptom caused by a deadly disease. They are similar, so guess what? According to Hahnemann, if let's say a man had that and they caught smallpox, it could remove the swelling of the testicle. Now, so imagine if a man is kicked and they have that symptom, they could run and just get a smallpox vaccine, and that would literally get rid of the swelling. That was supposed to be a joke, but so that literally would get rid of the swelling. I thought that was funny. That's a practical aspect of the organon. It can teach you some tips. So there's all these different diseases and examples here under the similar overlapping diseases. Measles, and let's see, the first example was smallpox and cowpox, and we have measles and whooping cough, and then we have measles and herpes. So imagine we have whooping cough. Let's say a child has whooping cough, and then we get a measles outbreak, and the parents are like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? The child has whooping cough, what if they catch measles? Well, the good news is, according to the organon, these are similar, and because they're similar, whichever one is stronger is going to remove the weaker one. So if the child has whooping cough and measles comes in, measles could literally annihilate whooping cough, or vice versa, whichever one is stronger in that person. So isn't that cool? You can predict what will happen if you have some basis, you have good solid foundation in homeopathy. You can make so many predictions. I just found this presentation just so fun to work on, but it was extremely frustrating because it was difficult. I had a hard time understanding the aphorisms. I had to email some of the experts in the world, and I learned a lot doing it actually over the last year. And here's a summary of literally a year's worth of work, which I think it might seem simple to you guys, but honestly, looking at the organon is so confusing, and so this is like a major simplification of the organon, and hopefully it'll help you guys. So, now, look at this one. Let's say a person has chronic herpes, and there's a measles outbreak going around in the society. Measles rash could literally cure chronic herpes once and for all because it's similar, and measles is stronger. So that's like the kind of thing, kind of understanding you can arrive at if you understand the organon. So let's see, what else do we want to cover here? Okay, man has advantages over crude nature. Aphorism 51 talks about that. We have thousands of medicinal substances capable of producing diseases in order to eradicate natural diseases based on the law of similars. And this is an overall summary at the bottom of the second page of your handout here. It's just a summary of the entire talk. So dissimilar diseases overlapping in same person at the same time. Again, they could either repel each other, suspend each other, or they could join each other and form a complex disease. And if you have similar diseases overlapping in the same person at the same time, the stronger one can remove the other. I think that's a good summary of the whole talk. And here's just some things I found on the internet when I was just doing research on overlapping diseases. I thought you might find that interesting. Let's say, and this is something that I see in my practice, by the way, acute COVID overlapping long COVID. Like, how do you handle that? I see a lot of cases, I still see them. They come in with long COVID, bryonia, and then they have Omicron, they need Kellybic, and I'm like, oh, interesting, the last week you've had Kellybic symptoms, but prior to that you had bryonia symptoms. As soon as Kellybic does its magic, Omicron leaves, then the long COVID bryonia symptoms return. I've seen so many of that. How many of you guys have seen that in your practices? Please raise your hand if you have seen it. Here we go. So people that do a lot of homeopathy, they see it. So this is just so common, I see it a lot. And how do you handle these cases? You treat what you see. So if a long COVID patient catches acute COVID and they have acute COVID symptoms, you treat that. When that's gone, then you go back and treat long COVID. So whatever symptoms come up, you treat it. That's the adaptability I was talking about. We are adaptable. This talks about why we didn't see common cold at all during the pandemic. It's the homeopathic reason is that they're similar. COVID is stronger, so it literally removed the cold virus for 2 years. And as COVID, the virulence of COVID went down, common cold went up. And there are other reasons, like, people wore masks, etc., lockdowns, yes. But the homeopathic interpretation of why we didn't see common cold is that COVID was stronger, so it literally removed cold. The cold virus, we didn't see hardly anybody. I didn't see a single case of cold for 2 years. And I believe that's the homeopathic reason. I knew it all along. I knew there had to be something beyond just the mask. This is the homeopathic rationale behind it. COVID and flu. They call it, in this article, they call it, oops, am I going the right way? They call it flurana, flu and COVID. So if a person catches COVID and flu at the same time, I have been wondering, well, what happens in a situation like that? What happens is what we talked about earlier. It depends on how the person's body perceives these two viruses going in. If the person's body considers them similar diseases, one will remove the other, right, based on law of similars. If the person's body considers these two dissimilar diseases, one can suspend the other, or they can combine and form a complex disease. Remember the summary of this? So you can apply that summary to all kinds of diseases potentially overlapping. So what happens, this is really important, what happens when two overlapping diseases affect the person at the same time? It depends on if the person's body perceives these two invading organisms, diseases, as similar versus dissimilar. So you can't really predict it, it just depends on how their body reacts. There's a concern, like what if COVID and flu combine and form a complex disease? What then? Well, it could become a more significant disease, but then we don't have to worry about that because we know how to treat complex diseases. We use different remedies at different stages of the illness, like Hahnemann suggested. Conventional doctors, based on what I found on the internet, they really didn't have a solid understanding or just based on my limited research, solid understanding of how to tackle these overlapping diseases. I think homeopathy, with the rich history we have in the Organon, we actually can offer help to the world on how to handle these overlapping conditions that could be deadly. So here's bird flu overlapping with human flu, which is a major concern. Remember, we talked about that at the beginning, how people are worried about overlapping bird flu and human flu in the same person at the same time. Well, what would happen in that situation is the same. It depends if the person's body considers these two invading organisms similar versus dissimilar. That's always going to be the case. It depends. These are just some other overlapping things I found, overlapping conditions, chronic and acute, different combinations. On the internet, gene swapping. Okay, now, top remedies for treating acute respiratory infectious conditions. These are just the top remedies that I find helpful in my practice, and I've summarized each one into a paragraph. Hopefully you'll find that helpful. You can read that yourself, I'm sure. Okay, so how about this? Look at this, poisons for pandemics. Why do I have that slide there? Because during the course of the pandemic, I heard a lot of my patients saying, I hear bryonia, I read bryonia is a good remedy for COVID, but it's a poison. There's articles on the internet that talk about how bryonia is a poison. And my response to them, of course, is the typical response that these remedies are highly diluted, you don't have to worry about any kind of toxicity. And in fact, most homeopathic remedies that are powerful, they come from poisonous sources. Let's take plague, for example. Plague, which is a disease we can contract from rats, According to Dr. Robin Murphy, one of my top teachers, he mentioned in his epidemics talk that snakes and spider venom, right? Snake and spider venoms, they fit the symptomatology of plague. So remedies made from snake and spider venom can be used to treat the plague, which comes from rats. So this would be a nice, I think, article that I probably will write someday. That's, I should say, the title would be something like Snake and Spider Venoms, they come to aid us against rats. Or snakes and spiders come to aid us against rats. And none of it sounds really appealing, but it's true. We're dealing with a lot of poisonous substances in medicine, in homeopathy, but they're all diluted, so we don't have to worry about any toxicity. Bryonia is a toxic herb again, but its symptoms match the signs and symptoms of COVID during the initial phase of the pandemic, as we talked about. Case taking, I just want to summarize the highlight. In homeopathy, we look at characteristic symptoms. We don't look as much at general. We pay attention to the general symptoms, but we pay particular attention to characteristic symptoms. Let me give you an example. Somebody says, I have a sore throat. A homeopath would be like, which side, left or right? And is it better with cold water or warm water? Those are characteristic symptoms. You can read about that. This is a summary of how do you manage epidemics. If you see symptoms, you give the remedy, the indicated remedy. If you don't see symptoms, the symptoms are absent, and you want to prevent, you give the genus epidemicus. That's a summary of that slide, extremely important. And we're doing acute prescribing in epidemic, when we treat epidemics. We're not doing constitutional. And you treat what you see. And you pick a remedy based on the top, like the top 3-4 remedies, symptoms that the patient have to match the top 3-4 keynotes of the remedy. Just we talked about, we're matchmaking. The top 3-4 symptoms of the patient should match the top 3-4 keynotes of the remedy. That's basically usually good enough. Not all the keynotes of the remedy have to be present in the patient. Frequency and potency, this slide summarizes pretty much everything I've learned during the course of the pandemic on frequency and potency. It depends on if you have a mild condition, moderate, or severe, you can read that. It's literally a summary of 3 years worth of experience with lots of COVID patients, so hopefully you'll find that helpful. This is a summary of what you do for prevention, a summary of what you do with no-sodes. This is just some basic tips regarding handling epidemics. With my COVID patients, I basically, and not even now really, we handle them virtually or over the phone, and I have them email me once or twice a day for simple check-ins, and I have them schedule follow-ups once or twice a week until they're out of the woods. That's just how I manage COVID and other infectious diseases. The choice of the remedy changes as the patient moves through the different stages of the acute illness, so the choice of the remedy literally, I could give one patient 2-3 remedies during the course of their acute infection. I did that during the initial phase of the pandemic. Presently, I don't need to do that. A lot of patients need Kellybeck. At least they did till recently. But during the initial phase of the pandemic, I would give bryonia for a week. Then I would have to change it to another remedy, gelsemium to wrap it up. I did that a lot. And here's various books you might find helpful in the subject of epidemics and pandemics. I'm just going to flip through them. You can look at those yourself. I just want to end with one quote. Oops, I don't know what happened. There, right there. The hour has struck for united homeopathic effort. I just want to just read this quote. If you can make that bigger so I can read it. There we go. Right there. This is a quote from Dr. Grimmer, medical doctor. I just love to finish my talk with that. Too long we have stood with the balm of healing in our hands, mute and dumb before the saturnalia of agony and black despair that mocks our gaze wherever we turn. The hour has struck for action and for united homeopathic effort in the conquest of man's most impeccable foe, the dread dragon, cancer. And I added the words, and pandemics. And I was waiting outside if you have any questions. You're welcome to come outside, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. And if you're virtual, you can email me. I'll be happy to respond to your emails. Thank you so much.